Welcome to the latest Birkbeck Connections video interview. Birkbeck Connections in organisational psychology aims to bring professional community together to share the latest evidence and trends in best practice, and of course to learn from each other. And I'm absolutely delighted here today to introduce our very own Professor Almuth McDowall.
Thank you very much, Jo, for the kind invitation. And I'm equally delighted to be here and to be welcoming my colleagues and friends, Professor Céline Rojon, who is currently based in Germany, and my colleague, Dr. Adun Okupe, who is currently based in Nigeria. So a very international collaborator team.
Great, and I'm really happy to be interviewing you today on your recently published paper that takes stock of how systematic reviews are carried out. Really interesting topic. So maybe we could start with you, Adun, and if you can maybe just tell us like where the idea for a systematic review of systematic reviews came from.
Thank you, Jo. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks, Almuth, and thanks, Céline, as well. I think it was a very interesting paper that we worked on. And the idea really came from when I was doing my PhD about 10 years ago. And Céline gave us a training with Professor Mark Saunders on systematic review methodology. And it was quite interesting as a doctorate student. And we started to look at how the systematic review methodology was applied in MOS, so management and organizational studies. And it was really the question, I think over several cups of coffee, we're having questions as to how this was applicable, why it wasn't being used, how it was widely used. And really just to see that from something that has been so powerful in terms of when you want to go into research, you need to go back and understand what has been done before to have a comprehensive, overview of the body of knowledge. And so that was what kind of started the paper, and it was really like an exciting journey. And we didn't know where it was going to lead, but I think we were happy with where it is now. So that's kind of where the idea came from.
Great. It's really good to hear kind of, where the stem of the idea came from, and then obviously seeing it in publication. Thank you. And Céline, maybe you could just talk us through the process that you went through.
Sure. And again, thank you very much for the invitation on this really interesting series that you're having. And I'm very happy to be joined by Adun and Almuth as well. And apologies in advance because this is going to be a slightly longer answer on the process. And it's very much oriented to how systematic reviews are done generally in management research, as we describe in our paper and as is described by other scholars as well. So we started out by talking to people that we consider experts in terms of either their expertise with literature reviews and systematic reviews in particular, or having done a lot of systematic reviews or literature reviews themselves, so having experience. And one person we spoke to and who's been a sounding board, I would say, throughout this research was Professor Rob Reiner, who's himself a proponent of systematic review methodology and evidence-based practice more widely. So speaking to these experts then, or interviewing them, we wanted to know what did they think of systematic review methodology, also in comparison to traditional reviewing approaches, and what would they like to see addressed in a study on systematic review. And one of the key takeaways from these expert interviews was that people were interested in further guidance on how to address challenges, methodological challenges of systematic review. So analyzing these interviews, we then did an initial non-systematic literature search as part of a scoping exercise to give us an idea of really what literature is out there on systematic review in management research. And this unsystematic scoping exercise helped us to plan our approach going forward. And crucially, it also enabled us to formulate some review questions that guided us going through the process, together with the insights from the expert interviews. Then we were able to start on the systematic review in earnest, undertaking literature searches, for example, looking in the big management research databases. We also hand searched some journals that like to publish systematic reviews. We looked in the database of the Center for Evidence-Based Management. We did citation searches, and we also considered literature suggestions from our expert panel and other fellow researchers. So we followed a few different search routes here. Some of these we did right from the very start. Some of them were suggested from the reviewers in the process of having this paper under review. So the citation searches, for example, they were kindly suggested by a reviewer, and they were actually really helpful, these suggestions. And in the process of the searching and also in some of the later stages, I think it's important to say we were also supported by several research assistants, because this is a really big task to do the searching and to analyze all the papers you find. Having then finished our searches, we assembled all the papers we found, we excluded duplicates, and that resulted in approximately 1,500 papers. In an initial stage, then we looked at the titles, abstracts, and methodology sections, and we applied 3 exclusion criteria. The first one being a very simple, can we understand the language that is being published in? And then more importantly, is it actually a systematic review, or is it some kind of other review or a different kind of paper altogether? And also, is it within the field of management research? Because our paper obviously focused on management research. We ended up having 391 papers that fulfilled our criteria. And then at the beginning, and as I mentioned before, we didn't have quite so many papers. We had maybe something like 80 papers. And as we went through the process of the review, reviewers, we had suggestions, we had various updates to our searches. So the number we ended up with obviously grew. And these papers we then fully read, and we drew out some important aspects. So descriptive statistics like publication year, but more importantly, qualitative information. So how had systematic reviews been conducted? What specific methods were used? For example, how did they synthesize information? What challenges did they encounter? And so forth. And we use a data extraction template to guide us in this process. We then analyzed and synthesized our data in a final stage, obtaining some basic statistics on where, when, and how systematic reviews have been conducted and published. And more importantly, we narratively integrated the papers, so summarizing the key themes, showing relationships between them, and using the qualitative data that we'd extracted to answer our review questions as well. At a later stage in the review process, so in the journal review process is what I mean here, we focused a bit more on the aspect of synthesis as well, because that was something that the reviewers were really keen on. In other words, what synthesis approaches had been used by authors of systematic reviews, had they given reasons for this, and so forth. And the very last step, as with any paper, we wrote up the study, and this was lastly and ongoingly as well. And as is often the case, the initial manuscript looked very different from the paper that is now published.
Wow, I mean, that just is so much work. I'm not surprised you had some additional support from research assistants. I think what you've highlighted is a very rigorous process that's involved in conducting systematic reviews. That's really interesting. Thank you. So, Almuth, what was the unique angle that you've then brought to this paper and this piece of research?
I think Céline already alluded to the fact that we really very much also wanted to draw out how have people actually synthesized primary studies. So systematic reviews originated in the health sciences and medicine, where basically you usually want to answer a question, well, does drug A work better than drug B? Whereas the questions that we want to answer in management research are not only does drug A work better than drug B, but why theoretically is the drug better? Are people more likely to take it? And so on and so forth. So in a subset of the 300 plus paper, we looked at much more in depth at actually how have people integrated the evidence. And there's a hierarchy. So at the very basic level, you aggregate evidence, which is basically counting frequencies. Then the next step is that you integrate evidence. So you look at what is similar and different across studies A, B, C, and D. then the step after that is you start to interpret. So, okay, so study A says this, study B says this, which you often find in the social sciences. Why is there such a difference? What could actually contribute that? And then the fourth step is that you look at explanation. So theoretically, why do these studies say that? This body of studies says exactly the opposite. Actually, what theoretically can account for this? Now, what we found in our analysis there is that no paper really got to this explanatory stage where people were actually using theory to really explain the pattern in their findings. And I think hopefully that is our unique contribution to the world of research and practice out there, to make that effort to really progress to that explanatory stage, so that not only are we observing data patterns in our systematic reviews, we also have a theoretical explanation for these patterns.
That makes a lot of sense. And I can see, you know, we're obviously all about evidence-based practice as this community, and actually getting to that level of 4 is when we can really use the evidence to put into practice. That's really, I can see the value in that. I was just going to move on to the next question around kind of framework. So within the paper, you guys referenced that there was a kind of overarching frameworks usually guide systematic reviews, but there seemed to be a bit of a lack of that for many of the papers that you reviewed. So I was interested, maybe Adun, you could answer this, is kind of which frameworks would you consider to be really useful for conducting systematic reviews?
Okay, I lost you there for a second, but I think the question is clear. So yes, in terms of the frameworks, we were quite interested in the element of synthesis. And just like Almuth has said, when you do a systematic literature review, you know, it's important to say, what are we finding out? What is really the whole essence of this? How do we distill the essence? Because what we found is that management and organizational studies scholars, you know, the process that Céline detailed, it's a very long process. It's a very rigorous process. And sometimes by the end of the process of, you know, reviewing, fact-finding, and trying to demonstrate the rigor that has been taken, the whole essence of the purpose for the systematic review then is given half a page, in some situation, a quarter of a page, in terms of what does this all mean? How do we apply the lessons that we found? And so what we tried to see was try to understand, first of all, if the question or the research question is that we're trying to solve a problem, particularly for management or organizational studies, i.e. for practitioners and also for policymakers, how do we distill this essence and how do we make it relevant for them? And so there are two distinct frameworks that we looked at and considered. There's the PICO that looks at the population or patient, and then it also looks at the intervention, and then it looks at the community, and then the outcome. And that is really in healthcare, because this is where systematic reviews came from. And so that's the Cochrane library, but we couldn't find any reference to MOS researchers using this model at all. And then the other model that we saw was the CIMO model, and that is context, intervention, mechanism, and outcome, that was put forward by Denia. And this was building on from Ray Parsons and Nicholas Tilley's work on realistic evaluation. And building on from that, it was the sense that how do we understand the context? How do we then say what interventions were taken, what was the mechanism for these interventions, and then what were the outcomes? And we saw that 17 colleagues were able to use the CIMO model and use it quite well. And so in terms of trying to encourage more researchers to look at existing models and to see how we can even advance and draw more from these models, we provided a little table, a guideline in our paper to say that if you would like to continue, consider the systematic review, this is how you can approach synthesis. Because synthesis is really important. It's very important, and sometimes it can even be the standalone output from a paper. And it's a shame that we're not doing quite as much in synthesis as we should, or as we can, because after going through the entire rigorous process, right? Imagine now having 70 pages, 80 pages in front of you that no one can really understand how they can apply it. And so our paper really is almost like an ambassador for synthesis, and to say that whenever we're doing work, and regardless of what approach is used, how do we ensure that the essence is not lost? And how do we remember? And this was a conversation Almuth and Céline and I had throughout the writing process, saying, what is the essence of this? What are we trying to say here? And how are we communicating this to the reviewers, one, but also to our colleagues, because that's also quite important. And so that's kind of what I would say, that spend a bit more time and give yourself a bit more time for the synthesis, look at the SIMO model, but also look at the table that we have provided to guide you.
Really helpful. And again, that's what I've really liked about your work here. It's practical and it's applied, and, you know, putting some good practice into place. So thank you, that was really helpful. So a particular question I was interested in at the minute is around grey literature, because certainly in some areas of organisational psychology, I mean, particularly if you think about hybrid work, the pace of the change is almost outpacing the academic literature. And so it was interesting to pick up in your paper around, you know, actually a lack of using grey literature. It's a reluctance. So I was interested, maybe we'll go back to Céline, your thoughts on the value of grey literature within systematic reviews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. So grey literature, we think, can add quite different aspects to a systematic review. So generally speaking, and as you were alluding to now as well, we would expect them to be more practice-oriented, possibly more policy-oriented. And we feel that this is something academic research often lacks or doesn't do well or sufficiently enough. So we think that it can contribute different angles, really. It can diversify knowledge, it can supplement knowledge that you get out of the systematic review on the one hand, and I think on the other hand, it can also make it more balanced and more comprehensive, as other people have also noted before us, and as such make it more applicable to practice and or policy. I do think that there are challenges, and I think that may be the reason why not many people have attempted to do it, also limitations, because I feel it's quite hard to be exhaustive about including grey literature. Like, where do you even start? Is it just governmental reports? Is it news articles? Is it blogs? Where do you start and where do you end? Where do you draw the line? Do you only include materials from credible sources, like government reports, book chapters, or would you also include blogs or tweets, for example, which people might consider less credible? Decisions have to be made here, and I think on the basis of some good justification, good reasons. One paper that we really liked and that gives some great suggestions on how to deal with grey literature is the one by Adams and colleagues in 2017. And so we would encourage any scholars who are considering using grey literature within their systematic reviews to look at this paper more closely and to try and go for it, but obviously to think about exactly how they want to do it and how they justify it as well.
That's really good advice, and it would be nice to see more grey literature reviews. So great advice. So I have a question for you, Almuth, around evidence maps. So in your in your suggestions for future research, you talk about evidence maps, and that wasn't something I'd come across before. So I'm really intrigued if you could tell us a little bit more about that concept.
So maybe if I use an analogy to explain this, so think about an evidence map almost as an interactive infographic. And, you know, in the olden days when explorers used to go to countries where nobody had been before, and they used to stick little pins in the maps where they had been. And think about an evidence map a little bit like this. So you will have an online database and you can map out. We know something about this. This is when SR has systematic review, SR for short, has already been, and we know something about this. This is where the evidence is strong. This is a blank spot on our map where we know very little. So the whole purpose about systematic review, of course, is to draw primary literature together, but you also want to know, has an SR already been done? Is there already evidence out there, so that you can know in advance where best to concentrate your efforts? Because I think, as all of us have learned the hard way, sometimes doing a systematic review is not for the faint-hearted, right? You need patience, you need perseverance, you need to find the motivation from within yourself to sustain yourself through the process. So if it's already been done, then what's the point of doing it? We really want to contribute something to knowledge. So that's what an evidence map is about, actually finding a way of summarizing, actually, this is where you need to go.
Great. I really love that analogy, and it's really helpful to kind of, again, think about, it's almost a bit mind mapping, isn't it, in terms of finding what you know and where the gaps are. That's really nice. Thank you. So on to our last question, and I'm going to ask each of you to give your perspective on this. And it was around, again, towards the end of your paper, you talk about that importance of moving to that greater collaboration between academics and practitioners. And we're hearing increasingly the word pracademic, you know, where we can take all this brilliant knowledge that is generated by fantastic researchers, but actually applying that in practice is going to where we can make a huge difference. So I was interested in your kind of thoughts on how we can continue to kind of close the gap and encourage, you know, future collaboration between academics and practitioners. So maybe let's go back to Adun on that one to start with.
Right, thanks, Jo. No, it's a very good question, and it's really about what are the implications of this and how do we ensure that more of the work that we do is relevant to businesses. And now I'm in Lagos Business School, where I teach strategy and sustainability. And speaking to business leaders, right, we focus primarily on, well, I teach mostly executive education. They don't have the time to process what has happened before, what hasn't happened before. You know, Nigeria is a developing economy, so the context of research is also, there's that paucity in terms of research funding and research grants. So it means that if you're doing research, it really needs to do a lot more. You need to ask of it to do a lot more, and that is about relevance and impact. How are we solving business problems? And one thing that COVID showed us as a business school is that we needed to really connect. You know, I mean, business schools are meant to be schools that contribute to business, right? And so it's that sense of we need to really go back again about essence. What's a business school about? What is it there for? How are we ensuring that businesses are coming to us and policymakers are approaching us with their problems? How are we solving these problems for them? And so it's on the other side of academia, is that how are we using research to influence their decisions? Because they don't have the time. They don't have the time to spend, how many years did we spend? A few, 3-4 years on a systematic review to see what has been done in A, B, C, or D. And we don't have the money for R&D in most departments. So it's really that sense of, if we're going to do work, let's make sure that it's solving crucial business problems, but let's also make sure that the messaging and the narrative is at an accessible medium and format. And that's part of why I like what we're doing here, because it's really saying, this is what we found. And what Almuth just said about the evidence map, we're trying to do a business strategy session as well for a company. They're trying to launch a new product. It's exactly the same thing. Using the evidence map to say, what has happened in this field before? Where's the opportunity? Where's the space? Again, can we connect more of that? And anyway, so that's kind of what I think we need to do more of in Nigeria, in Africa. Businesses really need to work more closely with academia, and it's on the part of the academics to push that, because the businesses are just really like in firefighting mode most of the time.
Great. And Céline, what's your perspective on that?
So I try to think from a more German angle, I suppose, working in a business school in Cologne here. And having also worked in consultancy, I know that in Germany, for example, there are various trade magazines which are widely read by research by practitioners, far more widely, obviously, than any academic paper, any academic journal. So therefore, I think it really makes sense for academics to write up a shorter, more focused version of their papers and to get it out in one of those trade magazines that are widely read as soon as possible, so that the newly gained insights they made can swiftly make their way into practice. And I think they should really focus on how the research findings can be applied to practice. Another aspect that came to mind, one thing that I like in Germany about the university system is that we have traditional universities, the sort of more research-focused universities, but we also have what they call applied universities, or Fachhochschulen. And my business school, for example, is one such applied university. And they have strong links to practice, these kind of universities. And the research that is undertaken by academic staff at these universities is also very much geared towards practice. Fortunately, there's less pressure on publishing in high-level academic journals, which helps to then do more practice-oriented research. But I think it is important for all researchers to try and forge links with organizations and for scientist-practitioner relationships and projects to be fostered. And I'm going to say a third point here as well. I also think it's useful for organizations to be proactive in staying up to date themselves. So of course, yes, the researchers have to do their part, but the organizations as well. They have to think about what scientific developments could be relevant to them. They could, for example, invite academics to talk to them about their recent research findings, and I think most academics would be quite happy to do that. They could employ work placement students, and hopefully these work placement students would bring some of the latest insights. And work placement is something that's very common in Germany, often a requirement of a university degree, very much necessary to secure employment after having studied for a degree. So I think those are possible options. I have a few other ideas, but I'm going to hand over to Almuth here, I think.
So as a dry, stuffy academic, I guess what I would say is you need to start in education, and you need to start people when you're educating them in business schools, in psychology, about evidence-based management and about the power of systematic reviews and actually knowing what evidence is good evidence and can I rely on. So just to give you an example, particularly when lockdown first happened here in the UK last year, I've never been busier as a consultant. So many organizations came to me and said, well, you know, we know our staff are struggling, but we don't know what to do about it. Do you know what? I think we're going to have some mental health first aid training for everybody. And I used to say, there is a better way, because look at the HSE website. They have got a very good rapid evidence assessment, which is like a truncated form of a systematic review, to say that actually, at best, it raises some awareness of mental health, but it does not instigate culture change. It won't transform your organization. Overall, also, the evidence is methodologically weak. It's not something that we can rely on. So then we used to have conversation about, well, really, what is a better starting point here? And very often it was around leadership. It was around job design, about, you know, people not really knowing, you know, one hand is doing this, the other hand, oh, I don't know what they are doing, and actually looking much more at communication in the organization and so on and so forth. So mental health first aid would only have been at best a sticking plaster, but it wouldn't have solved the issues that organizations were dealing with. So if through education we can develop that mindset to be scrutinizing of actually this is good evidence, this isn't good evidence, I think that is a really fundamental thing that we also ought to work at. And I agree with Céline, in education as well, we do need that collaboration between us academics and with practice to make sure that our education stays relevant and that we convey the messages in the right way.
Fantastic, some really practical advice there, and I can definitely vouch for the quality of the teaching at Birkbeck and around that critical thinking, but I think I'm a little bit biased. So thank you all so much for talking to our network today and sharing your really valuable insights. I certainly found it very interesting for myself personally, but I think the professional community will also find this really helpful. So thank you so much for your time, for Almuth and Adun and for Céline. Thank you so much.